Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. In a time scorched by the sun and scarred by war, when the only law was the speed of a man's draw, the future of the West would not be decided by gunslingers or generals. It would fall into the delicate hands of a widow, a woman whose only currency was courage and whose only weapon was a secret she would die to protect. So gather round and hear the tale of Isabel Hartley, a woman who, when faced with the wolves at her door, chose not to run, but to build a fortress from the ashes of her grief and lead a town to its last, desperate stand. This is the story of Haven's fury. The silence was the worst part. It was a physical entity in the town of Haven, a weight that settled in the midday heat and pressed down on the dusty street, smothering the memory of laughter. It was a silence born of fear, curated by grief, and it was the air Isabel Hartley breathed every day. 3 months had passed since the day the silence had been broken by the thunder of hooves and the sharp, final crack of gunfire. 3 months since she had become a widow. Haven was a town clinging to a precarious existence in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. It had been founded on a promise of peace, a place for families to put down roots after the nation had torn itself apart in the Civil War. But the war had left behind more than just scars and ghosts. It had unleashed a tide of rudderless, violent men, and the promise of Haven had become a fragile, whispered prayer. Isabel's house stood at the end of the main street, a small, neat clapboard home with a porch that her husband, Elias, had built with his own hands. Every plank, every nail was a memory. She spent her days in a fog of routine that kept the crushing weight of her loss at bay. She tended her small garden, mended clothes she no longer had a reason to mend, and stared out the window at a town that seemed to be holding its breath. She was a slight woman, with hair the color of autumn leaves that she kept pinned in a tight, severe bun, and eyes the pale, clear blue of a winter sky. Those who saw her saw a woman broken by tragedy, a fragile figure destined to fade like an old photograph. They saw the widow's weeds she still wore, the tremor in her hands as she bought flour at the general store. They did not see the core of iron resilience deep within her, a resilience she herself had not yet discovered. The memory of the massacre was a recurring nightmare that attacked her even in the daylight hours. It had been a day just like any other. Elias, a man whose quiet strength had been her anchor, was working at the small SE office he ran, weighing the meager findings of the local prospectors. Isabel had been hanging laundry, the clean scent of soap and sun in the air. Then came the riders. They were not a gang, not then. Just 5 men, their faces hard and cruel, led by a brute with a tangled black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. They had gone straight for the SE office. There was shouting, the splintering of a door, and then the first shot. The sound had ripped through the peaceful afternoon, a sound of such finality that it had frozen Isabel where she stood, a cloth aspen still in her hand. More shots followed. The town, which had so few men of fighting age to begin with, was paralyzed. Sheriff Miller, a good man worn down by age and the futility of his position, had been out of town. By the time a few brave souls had dared to peek out from their homes, the riders were gone, leaving behind 3 dead men, including Elias Hartley. They had taken nothing of value from the office, only turning it upside down in a frantic, violent search. Now, 3 months later, the fear from that day remained, a permanent resident of Haven. The silence was its calling card. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the mountains in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, the silence was broken again. Not by gunfire, but by the rhythmic, menacing plod of hooves. Isabel, standing at her window, felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. It was them. Not 5 men this time, but a dozen. They rode with an arrogant slowness, their dusters caked with the grime of the trail, their faces a gallery of casual cruelty. The man with the black beard was among them, but he was not leading. The man at the front was leaner, dressed in black, with a face that was all sharp angles and a cold, reptilian stillness. He surveyed the town not with a thug's bluster, but with an owner's appraising eye. The townspeople vanished. Doors were bolted, shutters were closed. Haven became a ghost town in the space of a heartbeat. The riders stopped in front of the saloon, dismounting with a jangle of spurs and a cloud of dust. They swaggered inside, their laughter a harsh, grating sound that violated the sacred silence. Isabel backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were back. And this time, it was not a random raid. This was an occupation. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what they were looking for. They had not found it 3 months ago, and they had returned to tear the town apart until they did. That night, long after the drunken shouts from the saloon had faded into a low murmur, Isabel knelt by the cold hearth in her small living room. She pried up a loose floorboard, the one Elias had shown her how to disguise. Her fingers trembled as she reached into the dark space beneath and retrieved a flat, oilskin-wrapped package. She brought it to the table, her hands smoothing the worn fabric. Inside was not gold or jewels, but a single piece of treated vellum. It was a map, drawn in Elias's neat, precise hand. It was a cryptic collection of symbols, landmarks, and what looked like celestial navigation points. To an outsider, it was meaningless. To the person with the key Elias had shared only with her in hushed, urgent whispers, it was the path to a fortune that could change the fate of the entire territory. It was the Confederate Eagle's Nest payroll, a fortune in gold bullion and freshly minted currency that had been secreted away in the final, chaotic days of the war. Elias, a Confederate quartermaster who had seen too much death and grown sick of the cause, had been tasked with hiding it. Instead, he had created this map, deserted, and made his way west, hoping one day to use the fortune not for a lost cause, but to build a true community, a real haven. "This is our future, Izzy," he had told her, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. "Not just ours. Everyone's. It's a foundation. But there are bad men who know it exists. They only know the man who hid it came this way. They don't know who he is. Promise me, you'll protect it. Not for the gold, but for the promise." She had promised. Now, the bad men knew. They might not have had a name 3 months ago, but they had found one. Hardly. And they had come back to finish their search. The weight of her promise, the weight of the silence, and the weight of the map in her hands felt heavier than the world itself. A part of her, the terrified, grieving part, screamed at her to run, to take the map and disappear into the wilderness. But as she looked around the small, quiet room, at the rocking chair he had built, at the mantelpiece he had carved, she knew she couldn't. This was her home. This was his legacy. Running would mean letting them win. It would mean letting his death be for nothing. The fragile woman the town saw began to recede, and in her place, something new and hard began to form. They had come for a dead man's secret. They would find a widow's fury instead. The new day dawned not with hope, but with a palpable sense of dread. The outlaws, who called themselves the Jackals, owned Haven. They treated the town as their personal fiefdom. The man in black, whose name was Kane, remained aloof, directing his men from the saloon's second-floor balcony. His second in command, the black-bearded brute named Dutch, was the visible face of their tyranny. He and his men walked the street with a proprietary swagger, taking what they wanted: food from the general store, a horse from the livery, whiskey from the saloon with no pretense of payment. Sheriff Miller, his face a roadmap of weary resignation, was powerless. He had confronted them once, his hand hovering over his old Colt, and had been met with a dozen pistols aimed at his heart. Dutch had simply laughed, taken the sheriff's gun, and handed it back to him empty. "Keep the peace, old man," the outlaw had sneered. "We're just visiting." It was a public humiliation that cemented the Jackal's control. Isabel watched it all from her window, her initial fear slowly calcifying into a cold, hard anger. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, flinch as Dutch snatched a loaf of bread from her hands. She saw young Timmy, the stable boy, close to tears as one of the outlaws kicked his dog for barking. Each small act of cruelty was a fresh log on the fire of her growing resolve. They hadn't come for her yet. They were being methodical, a pack of wolves circling their prey. They were searching, quietly at first. They started at the edge of town, questioning the few prospectors who lived in the hills, their methods growing more brutal with each denial. Isabel knew it was only a matter of time before their circle tightened and centered on her. The map was a burning weight in her house. She had to move it, to find a place so safe, so unassuming, that they would never think to look. Her mind, once occupied with recipes and household chores, was now consumed with strategy. She thought of Elias, of his careful, logical mind. He had been a planner. She would have to be one, too. Her gaze fell upon the town cemetery, a small, windswept plot of land on a low hill overlooking Haven. It was a place of sorrow, of endings. No one would think of it as a place of beginnings, a place to hide a future. Late that night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, she slipped out of her house, a small gardening trowel in her hand. The oilskin-wrapped map was hidden in the folds of her dark shawl. The cemetery was an eerie place, the simple wooden crosses and weathered headstones like skeletal fingers pointing at the star-dusted sky. She went to Elias's grave. The mound of earth was still fresh, the wooden marker stark and new. Kneeling in the dirt, the tears she had held back for so long finally came, silent and hot. It was an act of terrible desecration, disturbing his final rest. But it was also an act of profound devotion. She was not just protecting a map. She was protecting his dream, right here, in the very earth that held him. She dug a small, shallow hole at the base of the wooden cross, on the side away from the town. She placed the package inside, covering it carefully, patting the earth down, and scattering some loose leaves and pebbles over the spot to make it look undisturbed. It was done. The map was safe, hidden in the one place her heart could barely stand to go. The next day, Touch came for her. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open, the wood splintering around the lock. He filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the morning light, two of his men flanking him. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we have some questions for you." Isobel was standing by the table, a cup of tea in her hand. Her heart leaped into her throat, but her face remained a calm, pale mask. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. "You've broken my door, sir," she said, her voice steady, though her teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. Dutch chuckled, a humorless sound. "I can break a lot more than that. My employer, Mr. Kane, is a man of historical interests. He believes your late husband may have come into possession of an item from the war. An old Confederate map." "My husband was an assayer," Isobel replied, setting the cup down with deliberate care. "He dealt in rocks and dust, not relics." Dutch took a step into the room, his eyes scanning every corner. "He was a Confederate quartermaster before he dealt in rocks and dust. We know who he was. And we know he didn't leave the war empty-handed. We're going to find that map, ma'am. The easy way, or the hard way." He gestured to his men. "Search the place." They were brutally efficient. They overturned furniture, slashed open the mattress on her bed, threw her books to the floor. They tore apart the small house, a whirlwind of casual destruction. All the while, Dutch stood and watched her, his eyes boring into her, looking for a flicker of fear, a sign that they were getting close. Isobel stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. She watched them desecrate her home, her sanctuary, but her expression remained one of distant, sorrowful calm. She had already moved the heart of her home, the secret of it, to hallowed ground. This was just wood and fabric. Let them tear it apart. Inside, a fire was raging, but her face was ice. "They found nothing. It's not here," one of the men growled, kicking a broken chair leg. Dutch's eyes narrowed. He walked towards Isobel until he was towering over her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, but she did not flinch. "You're a cool one, ain't ya?" he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "But everybody breaks. We'll be back. And next time, we won't be so polite." He turned and strode out, his men following. Isobel was left standing in the wreckage of her home. The violation was profound. They had put their filthy hands on her life, on Elias's memory. She stood there for a long time, the silence returning, now filled with the ghosts of their threats. Then, slowly, methodically, she began to pick up the pieces. She righted the table, gathered the scattered books, tried to push the stuffing back into her mattress. With every small act of defiance, of putting her world back together, her resolve hardened. They thought she was a weak, helpless widow. They thought they could break her. Later that afternoon, she walked to the sheriff's office. Miller was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes full of pity and shame. "They destroyed my home, Sheriff," Isobel said, her voice flat, devoid of self-pity. "I know, Mrs. Hartley. I'm sorry. There was nothing I could do." "I am not asking you to apologize," she said, her tone hardening. "I am asking you what you intend to do." "Do?" He sighed, a sound of utter defeat. "Isobel, There are a dozen of them and one of me. The best thing you can do is leave. Get on the next stagecoach. Don't look back. This is my home, she said, her voice ringing with a strength that made the old sheriff look up in surprise. Elias died for this town. I will not let these animals dig up his grave to feed their greed. She leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. I am not running. The question is, are you going to stand with me, or are you going to let them burn this town to the ground? She turned and left before he could answer. She walked to the blacksmith's forge, where a burly, cynical man named Gunnery hammered out horseshoes, trying to ignore the outlaws who now controlled his town. She walked to the general store, where the owner, Mr. Henderson, nervously counted his dwindling stock. She spoke to each of them, her voice quiet but firm. She didn't have a plan yet. All she had was a single, impossible idea, a spark of defiance. She told them that running was a slower death. She told them that Haven was theirs, not the Jackal's. Most looked at her as if she were mad. They saw a grieving widow talking nonsense. But in a few eyes, she saw something else. A flicker of shame. A glimmer of the courage they thought they had lost. That night, she did not cry. She took one of Elias's old flannel shirts and began tearing it into strips to clean the pistol he had kept hidden in a box in the stable. It was a heavy, unfamiliar weight in her hands. She didn't know how to use it, but she would learn. The spark had been lit. Now, it was time to build the fire. The days following the ransacking of her home were a crucible for Isabel. The initial shock and violation gave way to a cold, clear-eyed purpose. She had drawn a line in the dust, not with a weapon, but with a refusal to be broken. Now, she had to convince others to stand with her on that line. Her first and most difficult task was to find an ally who could turn her resolve into a tangible threat. Her thoughts kept returning to one man, Gunnery, the blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man, with arms corded with muscle from a lifetime of hammering steel. He was also a cynic, his heart seemingly as hard as the iron he worked. He had lost a brother at Shiloh and had come west to escape causes and conflicts, only to find one had followed him. He spoke little, and his grunts were often more expressive than his words. But Isabel had seen the way his eyes lingered on the Jackals, a flicker of contempt in their gray depths. He was a man who understood the properties of metal. He knew that even the hardest iron could be broken if enough pressure was applied. She found him at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer the only defiant sound in the oppressed town. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. He didn't stop his work as she approached, only glancing at her from under his thick, sweat-soaked brows. Mr. Gunnery, she began, her voice steady despite the intimidating noise. Mrs. Hardly, he grunted, plunging a glowing horseshoe into a trough of water. It hissed and steamed, a violent exhalation. Come about the door. No, she said. I've come about the town. He finally stopped, placing his hammer on the anvil. He wiped his face with a greasy rag, his expression unreadable. Town's dyin'. Nothing to be done about it. A thing is only dead when people stop fighting for it, Isabel countered. He gave a short, harsh laugh. Fightin'? With what? Henderson's birdshot and Miller's empty holster. These ain't drunken cowboys, man. They're killers. Kane and Dutch. They're the real thing. And what are we? Isabel pressed, her voice gaining an edge. Sheep. Are we to just stand here and be shorn, or slaughtered when it suits them? We're survivors, he said, his voice low. There's no shame in it. My husband didn't survive. The Gables are being bled dry. The whole town is living in a cage of fear. That isn't survival, Mr. Gunnery. It's a slow death. I intend to fight, but I cannot do it alone. She finally came to the point, the words feeling strange and audacious on her tongue. I need you to teach me how to shoot. Gunnery stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He didn't see the fragile widow. He saw the glint of steel in her pale blue eyes. He saw a woman who had been pushed past the point of fear and had come out the other side holding something far more dangerous, resolve. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the embers in the forge. My husband, Elias, she continued, her voice softening slightly, he kept a pistol. A Colt. It's heavy. I don't know the first thing about it. Gunnery picked up a piece of scrap iron, his gaze distant. A gun ain't a magic wand, Mrs. Hartley. It's a tool. A loud, messy one. It kicks like a mule and it's as likely to get you killed as the other fellow if you don't know what you're about. Then teach me, she repeated, her voice unwavering. Teach me what I'm about. He looked from her determined face to the street outside, where one of the jackals was harassing a farmer who had come to town for supplies. He looked at the hammer in his hand, a tool for building, for creating. And he thought of the rifle he kept under his cot, a tool for something else entirely. Behind the forge, he said, his voice a low growl. After moonrise. Don't be seen. That night marked the beginning of Isobel's transformation. In the deep shadows behind the forge, with only the faint starlight to see by, Gunnery began her education. He was a harsh and forgiving teacher. He showed her how to hold the heavy colt, how to stand, how to breathe. You ain't holding a teacup, he'd grumble, adjusting her grip. Hold it like you mean it. It's a part of your arm. Point your soul at what you want to hit. The first time she fired it, the sound was a physical blow, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. The recoil slammed her shoulder, knocking her back a step, her ears ringing. The shot went wide, burying itself in the dirt wall of the arroyo behind the town. Again, was all Gunnery said. Night after night, they practiced. Her shoulder ached. Her ears rang constantly. The smell of gunpowder clung to her clothes and hair. She learned to load and unload the weapon in the dark, her fingers growing nimble and sure. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Gunnery set up old bottles and cans, and slowly, her wild shots began to land closer. The first time she shattered a bottle, the sound was a small, sharp victory that echoed in the silence. During the day, she was still the quiet widow, but her purpose gave her a new lens through which to see the town. She began to speak to others, not with the fiery rhetoric of a revolutionary, but with the quiet logic of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She spoke to Mr. Henderson, the store owner, as he tallied up the debts the jackals had accrued. How long can you sustain this, Mr. Henderson? She asked simply. Before they've taken everything, and you have nothing left to sell to the rest of us. She spoke to Doc Miller, the town's physician, and the sheriff's brother, a man of science who felt helpless against the disease of violence. A sickness must be fought, she told him, whether it's in the blood or in the street. To do nothing is to let it win. Her words, combined with the jackal's escalating arrogance, began to have an effect. Dutch and his men grew bolder, their casual cruelty becoming a daily spectacle. The fear in Haven began to curdle, changing into a sour, simmering resentment. The spark Isobel had lit was finding dry tinder. The turning point came a week later. Kane, growing impatient, decided he needed to shake the town's tree and see what fell out. He ordered Dutch to make a public example. Their chosen target was the town's small church. They strode in during the Sunday service, their spurs scraping on the wooden floor. Dutch walked to the pulpit, tore the Bible from Reverend Michael's hands, and tossed it to the floor. Sermon's over, preacher, Dutch sneered. This is a house of business now. We'll be storing our extra supplies here. God can find somewhere else to sleep. The congregation was frozen in horrified silence. Reverend Michael, a gentleman whose faith was his only shield, stood his ground. This is a house of God, sir, he said, his voice trembling but firm. You are not welcome to defile it. For his defiance, Dutch backhanded him across the face, sending the old man sprawling to the floor. Something broke in the town of Haven. It was one thing to steal and intimidate. It was another to strike a man of God in his own church. From the back of the congregation, a heavy clang echoed. Gunnery stood there, a length of iron chain held in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. Before the jackals could react, several other men stood up: Henderson, Doc Miller, a few ranchers who had been in for the service. They were unarmed, but they were standing. Dutch, surprised by the sudden, united defiance, hesitated. His men drew their guns, the clicks of the hammers loud in the sacred silence. For a tense moment, the church was a powder keg. It was Isobel who diffused it. She stepped forward from the pews, placing herself between the townsmen and the outlaws. She looked directly at Dutch, her pale blue eyes holding no fear. You have made your point, sir, she said, her voice calm and clear, ringing through the church. The building is yours, but the people are not. Dutch was taken aback. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected this slip of a woman to face him down with such unnerving composure. He looked at the grim faces of the standing men, at Gunnery's murderous glare, and made a calculation. A bloody fight over a dusty church wasn't worth it. Not yet. Have it your way, he snarled, forcing a grin. He turned to the congregation. This town belongs to us. Don't any of you forget it. He and his men backed out of the church, their bravado ringing hollow. As the doors swung shut behind them, a new kind of silence fell. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a decision being made. That evening, 5 men knocked on the door of Gunnery's forge. Sheriff Miller was with them. A little while later, Isabel Hartley slipped through the shadows and joined them. The resistance had been born. In the heart of the forge, surrounded by the tools of creation, the good people of Haven began to plan for destruction. The back room of the forge became Haven's secret heart, a war room lit by the flickering glow of a single lantern. The air was thick with the smells of coal, sweat, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. The group was small: Isabel, Gunnery, Sheriff Miller, his brother the doc, and Henderson, the store owner. They were a council of the willing, the first to stand up from a town that had been on its knees. Sheriff Miller, his face etched with a mixture of shame and renewed determination, was the first to speak. "I've been a fool," he said, his voice raspy. "A coward. I let my age and my fear get the better of my badge. That ends tonight. This is my town, and I'll be damned if I let it die without a fight." It was a confession and a declaration, and it fundamentally shifted the dynamic. The law, however beleaguered, was with them. But it was Isabel who became the group's unwilling and spoken leader. While the men spoke of tactics and firefights, she thought in terms of strategy and survival. Her mind, honed by years of managing a household on a tight budget, of planning for harsh winters and dry summers, saw the town not as a battlefield, but as a fortress waiting to be revealed. "We cannot fight them head-on," she stated, her quiet voice cutting through the men's more heated discussion. "They have more men, more guns, and more experience in killing. A straight fight in the street is suicide. We won't win by being stronger. We'll win by being smarter." She unrolled a piece of butcher paper Henderson had brought from his store. On it, she had drawn a remarkably accurate map of Haven, sketched from memory. It showed every building, every alley, every well. "This is our advantage," she explained, her finger tracing the lines. "We know this place. They don't. We have to use that." Her plan was audacious, born of a woman's logic and a deep understanding of the town's hidden spaces. "Many of the older buildings," she said, pointing to the general store, the saloon, and the building that housed Doc Miller's office, "have root cellars. Elias once told me that when the town was first built, there was talk of connecting them as a shelter in case of Apache raids. It was never done," Doc Miller interjected. "Just talk." "But the cellars are there," Isabel insisted. "And the ground is soft. Gunnery, you have mining tools. Henderson, your cellar shares a wall with the saloons. We can connect them. We can create a hidden network beneath their feet, a way to move, to communicate, to attack from where they least expect it." The idea was met with a stunned silence, then a slow dawning of appreciation. It was brilliant. It turned their greatest weakness, being trapped in the town, into their greatest strength. Gunnery's grim face broke into a rare, wolfish grin. "A bit of digging," he rumbled. "I can do that." The work began that very night. It was a secret, back-breaking labor. Under the guise of darkness, Gunnery and Henderson, later joined by a few other trusted men, began to dig. They used blankets to muffle the sound, carrying the dirt out in buckets to be scattered in the arroyo. During the day, they were shopkeepers and blacksmiths. At night, they were sappers, building a subterranean lifeline. Isabel, meanwhile, focused on the defenses above ground. She walked the town with a new eye, seeing not homes and businesses, but firing positions and fields of fire. She and Sheriff Miller identified key windows, weak doors, and vulnerable alleys. "The hotel across from the saloon," she pointed out to the sheriff. "Its second-floor window has a perfect view of the saloon's entrance. If we could get a rifleman there." "Old man Peabody's room," Miller nodded. "He's half-deaf and wouldn't ask questions." They began to secretly fortify the town. Heavy furniture was marked to be moved in front of doors and windows. Loopholes, easily concealed by a drape or a crate, were cut into walls. They laid plans for simple but effective traps, tripwires connected to strings of cans to create alarms, weakened support beams in the livery that could be brought down to block the entrance. Each plan was a small, silent act of rebellion. Isobel's training with gunnery continued. She was becoming proficient with the Colt, her movements sure and steady. But she knew a pistol was a close-range weapon. She needed to learn to use a rifle. Gunnery unearthed an old but well-maintained Winchester from a hidden crate in his forge. It was lighter than a military rifle, a weapon for a hunter, not a soldier. It suited her. The kick was still jarring, but the accuracy, the ability to reach out and touch a target from a distance, felt like a revelation. Hitting a can at 50 yards gave her a grim satisfaction she had never known before. It was the feeling of control, of having an answer to the violence that had been visited upon her. As the town secretly transformed itself, Kane and his men grew more agitated. Their search for the map had yielded nothing, and the town's subtle shift from cowed submission to quiet defiance was not lost on them. The open taunts from the jackals were now met not with fear, but with stony silence. Dutch could feel the change, and it infuriated him. He decided to push back. One afternoon, he and 3 of his men cornered young Timmy, the stable boy, accusing him of hiding supplies from them. They began to beat him, their casual cruelty on full public display in the middle of the street. It was a test, a reassertion of dominance. But Haven was no longer the same town. From his office, Sheriff Miller emerged, his old Colt now loaded and strapped to his hip. "That's enough, Dutch," he said, his voice carrying the rediscovered weight of his badge. Gunnery appeared at the entrance to his forge, a heavy hammer swinging loosely in his hand. Henderson stepped out onto his porch with a shotgun cradled in his arms. Doors opened along the street, and silent, grim-faced men and women watched. They were all unarmed, except for the sheriff and Henderson, but their collective presence was a wall. Dutch, seeing the boy bleeding on the ground and the line of defiant faces, was momentarily stunned. He laughed, but the sound was strained. "Getting brave, are we?" he sneered. "This town is starting to bore me. I think it's time we liven things up." He and his men swaggered off, leaving the boy sobbing in the dust. That night, in the nearly completed tunnel between the store and the saloon, the council met again. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. "They're done waiting," Miller said, his face grim. "That was a final warning. They're going to hit us, and hit us hard." "Then let them come," Gunnery growled, his knuckles white as he gripped his hammer. "They will come for me first," Isobel said, her voice cutting through the tension. "They still believe I have the map. They'll use me to break the town, or the town to break me." She looked at the faces in the lantern light, the faces of her friends, her army. "We have prepared. We have our fortress. Now we just need to bait the trap." Her plan was simple and terrifying. She would be the bait. She would give Kane a reason to believe the map was within his grasp, a reason to commit all his forces to one final, all-out assault on a single location, her home. While they focused their rage on her, the rest of Haven would spring the trap. The town was a powder keg, and Isobel Hartley was about to strike the match. The tension in Haven grew so thick it felt like a physical presence, a humid, breathless wait before a summer storm. The jackals no longer bothered with searches. They were a coiled snake, waiting for the order to strike. Kane remained in the saloon, a spider in his web, while Dutch and his men patrolled the street, their nerves fraying, their tempers turning hair-trigger volatile. They knew the town had changed, and the not knowing how or why not at them. Isobel's plan to make herself the bait required a delicate touch. She had to be convincing. She started by subtly changing her routine. She began taking late-night walks, always in the same direction, towards the town cemetery. One of Dutch's men, a greasy, weasel-faced man named Cale, was often on watch near her end of town. She made sure he saw her slip out, a small bundle under her arm, and return an hour later, empty-handed. She did this twice. On the third night, she made her move. As she returned from the cemetery, she accidentally dropped a small, folded piece of paper near the darkened alley where Cale was hiding. She paused, looked around as if she'd lost something, and then, with a show of frustration, continued to her house. She knew he would retrieve it. The paper was a masterful piece of misdirection, a single page torn from one of Elias's old geology journals. On it were his familiar, precise drawings of rock strata, but Isobel had added a few cryptic symbols and a compass rose in the corner, mimicking the style of the real map. It was meaningless, but it looked authentic. It was the scent of blood in the water. As she had predicted, Cale took the bait directly to Kane. From her darkened window, Isobel watched the lights in the saloon burn late into the night. They were planning. The trap was set. The next morning, Sheriff Miller received an unexpected visitor. A dusty, sweat-stained man wearing the badge of a territorial marshal rode into town, his horse moving at a weary trot. He was an older man, with a walrus mustache and tired, cynical eyes. He introduced himself as Marshal Davies. "Heard you've been having some trouble out here, Miller," Davies said, dismounting in front of the sheriff's office. The arrival of a higher authority should have been a relief, but Sheriff Miller felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Davies didn't have the look of a lawman riding to the rescue. He had the look of a vulture circling a kill. "We're managing," Miller said cautiously. "Managing?" Davies scoffed, gesturing towards the saloon where several jackals watched them with open amusement. "Looks to me like you've lost control of your town. I'm here under the authority of the territorial governor. There's a land grant dispute. Seems the original charter for this town might be invalid. A certain railroad concern has a prior claim." It was a lie, and they both knew it. This was Kane's checkmate. He had a corrupt official on his payroll. Davies wasn't here to enforce the law. He was here to provide a legal smokescreen for Kane's takeover. The confrontation took place in the street. Davies, flanked now by Kane and Dutch, formally read a proclamation declaring the Haventown charter null and void. He ordered the citizens to lay down any arms and accept the provisional authority of his new deputious jackals. It was a moment of truth for Sheriff Miller. He could bow to the authority of the marshal's badge, as he had been trained to do his entire life, or he could stand with the town he had sworn to protect. He looked at Kane's smug face, at Davies's dead eyes, and then he looked down the street towards Isobel's house. He drew a deep breath. "I recognize your authority, Marshal," Miller said, his voice clear and steady. "But I don't recognize these men as your deputies. And this proclamation." He took the paper from Davies's hand. "Double quotes. Is not worth the paper it's printed on. This town was founded on sweat and blood, not on some railroad lawyer's trickery. We are not ceding our homes." He tore the proclamation in half and let the pieces flutter to the dust. Davies's face turned purple with rage. "That's sedition, Miller. You're under arrest." "No," Miller said, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his Colt. "I don't believe I am." From doorways and windows, the silent faces of Haven's citizens watched. Gunnery stood on his porch, his shotgun held ready. The town was holding its breath. Kane, seeing his legal gambit fail, finally lost his patience. The pretense was over. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly to Davies. "We have what we came for anyway." He turned his gaze down the street, directly at Isobel's house. "The map. The woman has it. Tonight, we end this." The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. Davies, his authority now meaningless, mounted his horse and rode out of town, a coward fleeing the fire he had helped to start. The lines were drawn. The battle for Haven would begin at sundown. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, menacing shadows across the street, the town prepared. It was a quiet, desperate ballet of preparation. Women and children were moved into the newly connected cellars, the safest place in town. Men took up their designated positions, rifles ready. Henderson and Doc Miller were in the hotel room opposite the saloon. Gunnery and two ranchers were on the roof of the general store. Sheriff Miller and 3 others held the center line, using a barricade of wagons. Isobel was alone in her house. She dragged a heavy bookshelf in front of the door and a thick oak chest in front of the main window, leaving only a small loophole to see and fire through. She laid out her weapons on the table, the Colt, its cylinder full, and the Winchester, with boxes of cartridges lined up beside it. The house was no longer her home, it was a pillbox, the linchpin of the entire town's defense. She thought of Elias, of his quiet strength, of the promise he had extracted from her. She was not just defending a town or a map. She was defending the very idea of a future, a promise made to a dead man. She checked the action on the Winchester, the metallic click a sharp, reassuring sound in the suffocating silence. The sun dipped below the Dragon Mountains, and the world was plunged into a deep, purple twilight. From the saloon, a single shot rang out, the prearranged signal. The final siege of Haven had begun. The jackals came, not as a wave, but as shadows, using the growing darkness to their advantage, all of them converging on the one small house at the end of the street. They were coming for the widow, and for the promise she held in lead and steel. The first assault came not with a thunderous charge, but with a creeping, venomous stealth. Cain was no fool. He wouldn't send his men into a clear field of fire. They used the deepening twilight as a cloak, fanning out, moving from shadow to shadow, their dark forms flitting between the buildings. Their target was singular and absolute, the small clapboard house at the end of the street. To them, it was the treasure chest, and the widow inside was the only thing standing between them and the key. From her loophole, Isabel watched them come. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady. The world had shrunk to this small rectangle of vision, to the heavy weight of the Winchester in her hands. The lessons gunnery had taught her played through her mind. Breathe. Squeeze. Don't jerk. Make every shot count. She had so few bullets, and they had so many men. The town held its breath. The hidden riflemen in the hotel, on the roof of the general store, waited for the signal. The plan, as Isabel had laid it out, was to let the jackals commit, to let them think their assault on her home was going uncontested. They had to draw as many of them as possible into the narrow confines of the street in front of her house, a pre-designated kill zone. 2 of the outlaws were the first to break cover, rushing the last 20 yards to her porch. They carried a heavy log, a makeshift battering ram to smash down her barricaded door. This was the signal. Isabel lined up her sights on the lead man, his face a grimace of effort in the gloom. She took a steadying breath, the scent of gunpowder already a ghost in her nostrils. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report was the roar that broke the dam of silence. It was the first shot in Haven's war. The outlaw with the log cried out a choked, surprised sound, and pitched forward, the battering ram falling from his lifeless hands. His partner, stunned, hesitated for a fatal second. From the roof of the general store, gunnery's rifle bellowed its own deep-throated reply. The second outlaw was thrown backwards, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The trap was sprung. Suddenly, the quiet street erupted into a hellish crossfire. Muzzle flashes bloomed from the hotel window, from the store's roof, from behind the wagon barricade. The jackals, caught in the open, were completely surprised. They had expected a single point of resistance. Instead, they had walked into a meticulously planned ambush. Men screamed and fell. The confident swagger of the gang dissolved into panic chaos. They fired wildly at the unseen sources of the attack, their bullets splintering wood and ricocheting off stone with angry whines. Dutch, bellowing curses, managed to rally his men. To the walls, he roared, firing his own pistol towards the hotel. Get cover. Pincer the house. He was a seasoned fighter, and his instincts were sharp. He recognized the trap and knew their only chance was to press the attack on the primary target, to break the linchpin of the defense. While some of his men provided suppressing fire, Dutch led a small group in a desperate scramble, hugging the walls of the neighboring buildings, closing in on Isabel's house from the sides. Out of the main lines of fire, Isabel saw them coming. She was no longer just a sniper, she was the commander of her small fortress. She left the front window and moved to a side window she had prepared, one looking out over the narrow space between her house and the next. 2 of Dutch's men were there, trying to smash their way through her kitchen window. She fired the Winchester through the glass, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. 1 man fell. The other returned fire, his bullets tearing through the thin wall of the house, shredding a set of curtains, shattering a porcelain plate on a shelf. The sound of her home being torn apart, of this violence invading her sanctuary, fueled a cold, protective fury in Isabel. She worked the lever on the Winchester, chambered another round, and fired again. The second man outside went silent, but the assault was relentless. While she was occupied, she heard a heavy thud against her back door, followed by the splintering of wood. They were breaking through. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. There was no time for fear. She dropped the rifle, drew the heavy Colt, and moved to stand in the doorway between the small living room and the kitchen. The back door groaned, then burst inward. A hulking outlaw stood silhouetted against the night sky. He saw her and raised his pistol, a triumphant grin on his face. The Colt bucked in Isobel's hand, its roar filling the small kitchen. It was the first time she had fired a pistol at a man, at a living, breathing target just feet away. The outlaw was slammed back against the doorframe, his grin replaced by a look of profound, terminal surprise. But there was another one right behind him. He lunged into the room, not firing, but tackling her. His momentum carried them both to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The Colt flew from her hand, skittering across the floorboards into the darkness. She was pinned, the man's foul breath hot on her face, his hands fumbling for a knife at his belt. She fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. She was not a trained fighter, but she was a survivor. She clawed at his eyes, kneed him in the groin. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Her hand, scrambling on the floor, found something heavy and solid, a cast-iron skillet from the hearth. With a desperate, guttural cry she swung it, putting all her grief, all her rage, all her fear into the blow. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crunch. He went limp, collapsing on top of her. Gasping for air, she shoved the dead weight off and scrambled to her feet. She was bruised, shaking, and covered in dust, but she was alive. She found her pistol and stumbled back to the front room. The main firefight was still raging outside, but the initial, furious assault on her house had been repelled. The bodies of the men who had tried to take her fortress lay still in the moonlight. She had held the line. Her small home, once a symbol of her grief and isolation, had become the anvil upon which the jackal's teeth were breaking. The initial, furious assault had been broken, but the battle for Haven was far from over. The night was now a chaotic patchwork of deadly silence and sudden, vicious eruptions of gunfire. The jackals, having learned a bloody lesson about open charges, had dug in. They took cover behind buildings and alleyways, and in the livery stable, turning the town into a deadly labyrinth. The fight devolved into a tense, nerve-wracking siege. From the saloon's second-floor balcony, Kane watched the battle unfold with a cold, calculating fury. His plan for a quick, brutal decapitation had failed. The widow was tougher than he'd imagined, and the town was not the flock of sheep he had been led to believe. His force was being led, man by man, by an enemy that was seemingly everywhere and nowhere at once. His impatience was turning to ice-cold rage. He wanted the map, but now he also wanted to burn this defiant town to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. He sent a runner to Dutch with new orders. No more surgical strikes. This would be a battle of attrition and terror. The new target, the general store. It was a strategic choice. It was the center of the town's riflemen, a known strongpoint, and, most importantly, it was a symbol of the community's sustenance. Breaking it would be a blow to both their tactical position and their morale. Inside the cellar network, now a nexus of communication and supply, Doc Miller was tending to the wounded. One of the ranchers from the roof had taken a bullet in the shoulder. The doc, his hands stained with blood, worked by the light of a single lantern, his medical bag open beside him. Women moved silently through the tunnels, carrying ammunition, water, and bandages from one position to another, their fear channeled into a quiet, efficient purpose. They were the town's lifeblood, operating unseen beneath the battle. Isobel, her own breathing ragged, her cheek bruised from the fight in her kitchen, reloaded her weapons. The lull in the attack on her house was more unnerving than the fight itself. She knew they hadn't given up. She crept to her window and peered out. She saw the muzzle flashes from the hotel and the general store roof, answered by flashes from the saloon and the livery. But then she saw something else, a small group of jackals, moving under the cover of a massive volley of suppressing fire, were not heading for her, but for the general store's side entrance. She had to warn them. There was no time to use the tunnel. She did the only thing she could. She opened her window a crack and fired the Winchester, not at a man, but at the large metal bell that hung outside the firehouse, halfway down the street. The bullet struck the bell with a loud, discordant clang that cut through the cacophony of the gunfight. It was a sound no one expected. She fired again. CLANG. On the roof of the store, Gunnery understood immediately. It wasn't a random shot, it was an alarm. He peered over the edge of the roof just in time to see the jackals planting a dynamite charge against the store's side door. "Get down," He roared to the men with him. "They're blowing the door." He fired down at them, but it was too late. The fuse was lit. The explosion was a deafening roar that shook the entire street. Wood, glass, and debris flew through the air. The side of the general store was a gaping, smoking hole. Through the smoke and dust, the jackals charged in. The fight for the general store was a close, brutal affair. Henderson, the store's owner, a man who had never fired a gun in anger in his life, stood behind an overturned counter and fired his shotgun, his face a grim mask of terror and determination. The blast tore through the first two outlaws who charged through the breach. But more came after them. The battle had found a new heart, a new center of gravity. The firefight in the street dwindled as both sides focused their attention on the store. From his position, Sheriff Miller saw what was happening and knew they couldn't lose the store. It was their main arsenal and their strongest defensive position. "Cover me," he yelled to his men at the barricade, and he made a desperate run across the open street, firing his Colt as he went. From her house, Isobel watched in horror and admiration. The sheriff, the old man who had been ready to give up, was now charging into the heart of the fire. She had to help him. She couldn't fire into the store without risking hitting Henderson or the sheriff, but she could suppress the jackals who were trying to reinforce the attack. She began to fire her Winchester with a methodical rhythm, no longer aiming for kills, but to control movement. She laid down a steady, accurate fire on the alleyway from which the jackals were emerging, kicking up dust and splintering wood, forcing them to keep their heads down, isolating the group that was already inside the store. Her actions gave Miller the opening he needed. He reached the store, diving through the smoking hole in the wall. The scene inside was chaos. Henderson was wounded, slumped against the counter, but still trying to reload his shotgun. 3 jackals were advancing on him. Miller opened fire, his shots precise and deadly. 2 of the outlaws went down. The third spun around and fired, and the sheriff cried out, clutching his leg as he fell. The outlaw grinned, raising his pistol for the killing shot. Suddenly, a massive shape appeared in the store's backroom doorway. Gunnery. He had come down from the roof. He held no rifle, no pistol. In his hands, he wielded his massive blacksmith's hammer. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he charged. The outlaw turned, his eyes wide with shock, but he had no time to fire. The hammer, a tool of creation, became an instrument of brutal, final judgment. The general store was secured, but at a high cost. Both Miller and Henderson were wounded. The town's defenses were battered. And in the saloon, Kane watched the store fall silent and knew his moment had come. He had softened them up. He had drawn their defenders into a central fight. He smiled. It was time for the head of the snake to strike. He gathered his final reserve, his most loyal and deadly men, including the hulking, vengeful Dutch. Their target was no longer the general store. It was the house at the end of the street, which he now knew would be lightly defended. He was going to collect his map, and his widow, personally. The lull after the fight at the general store was heavy and deceptive. From her window, Isobel could see the flickering lanterns as Doc Miller and others braved the street to drag the wounded sheriff and Henderson to safety. The town had held the line, but they were bleeding, their numbers dwindling. She knew the battle wasn't over. Kane wasn't a man to accept defeat. He had been testing their defenses, probing for a weakness. Now, in the relative quiet, she felt a cold certainty. He was coming for her. Her house was a wreck, the air thick with plaster dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The bodies of the men she had killed were grim, silent testament to the battle that had been fought within these walls. She was alone, her ammunition running low. The initial plan had been for the town to draw the jackals' fire, but now the town's defenders were pinned down, tending to their wounded. She was isolated, just as Kane had intended. She took a moment to reload, her fingers moving with a practiced efficiency that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. She had a handful of rounds left for the Winchester and 2 full cylinders for the Colt. It wouldn't be enough. It was then that her eyes fell on the hearth. Not at the skillet she had used as a weapon, but at the fireplace itself. Elias, a man who always thought of contingencies, had built it. He had shown her a secret once, a small, hidden compartment behind a loose fire brick where he kept a stash of emergency money. But it wasn't money she was thinking of now. It was something else he had stored there, something he had brought with him from the war. She pried the brick loose. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 sticks of dynamite and a small coil of fuse. "You never know when you'll need to clear a stump, Izzy," he had said with a sad smile, but she knew he wasn't thinking of stumps. He was thinking of a last resort. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was not a sapper. She knew nothing of explosives. But she was a quick study, and desperation was a powerful teacher. She saw the plan, complete and terrifying, in a flash of inspiration. It was a final, desperate gamble. A widow's gambit. She took 1 stick of dynamite and a short length of fuse. She moved the heavy bookshelf she had used to barricade the front door, positioning it a few feet back. She placed the dynamite in the small gap between the door and the bookshelf, then ran the fuse under the rug towards the back of the room. She did the same with the second stick at the back door. The third stick, her last, she kept with her. She retreated to the root cellar, the trapdoor concealed beneath a large rug in the center of the room. She left it open just a crack, the Winchester resting on the edge, aimed at the front door. She waited. The silence was absolute. Then she heard it. Not the sound of a large group, but the quiet, stealthy footsteps of a few men. They weren't trying to break the door down. They were picking the lock. Cain was done with brute force. He was coming in like a thief. The lock clicked. The front door creaked open. In the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered windows, she saw 3 figures slip inside. The lean, predatory form of Cain, the hulking shadow of Dutch, and 1 other man. "Find her," Cain whispered, his voice a venomous hiss in the quiet room. "She's in here somewhere. The map is on her." They began to move through the wreckage of the room, their pistols drawn. Isobel's breath caught in her throat. Her plan had been to wait for them to get close to the dynamite, and then light the fuse. But how? She couldn't risk a spark without giving herself away. She had miscalculated. Her trap was useless. Dutch, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, spotted the rug that was slightly askew. The rug that covered the cellar door. "Boss," he grunted, pointing. Cain's cold eyes fixed on the spot. A slow smile spread across his face. "Clever girl," he murmured. He started to walk towards the cellar door. Isobel knew she had only seconds. It was over. But she would not be taken. She would not let him get his hands on Elias's legacy. She thought of the promise she had made. A promise in lead. And in fire. With a defiant cry, she pushed the cellar door open and fired the Winchester. The shot was not aimed at Cain, but at the lantern he held in his hand. The bullet shattered the glass. Iron flame exploded outwards, spraying across the floor. The flames instantly ignited the fuse to the dynamite at the front door, which now sizzled and sparked, racing across the floor like a fiery serpent. Cain and his men stared in horror at the burning fuse. They had walked into a deadfall. "Out!" Cain shrieked, his composure finally shattering. He and the other man scrambled for the side window, diving through it in a spray of glass and splintered wood. But Dutch was too big, too slow, and too close to the front door. He turned to run, his face a mask of pure terror. He never made it. The explosion was a titanic, deafening roar. The entire front of the house disintegrated in a blast of fire and splinters. The shockwave threw Isobel back down the cellar stairs, the trapdoor slamming shut above her, plunging her into absolute darkness. The sounds of the blast were followed by the groan of tortured timber and the crash of the collapsing roof. Silence. Slowly, dazed and deafened, Isobel pushed herself up. Above, she could hear the crackle of flames. Her home was burning. Her trap had worked, but she was buried in it. She was in a tomb of her own making. Panic, real and suffocating, finally took hold. She pushed at the trapdoor, but it wouldn't budge. The wreckage from the collapsed roof had pinned it shut. She was trapped. The explosion rocked Haven to its foundations. It was not the sound of a gun, it was a primal roar, a column of fire and smoke that tore a hole in the night sky. For a moment, the gunfight stopped as every combatant, both townsfolk and outlaw, stared in stunned silence at the inferno that had once been Isobel Hartley's home. To the people of Haven, it looked like the ultimate act of destruction by the jackals. Their hearts sank. The house, their strong point, was gone. And the woman who had become their symbol of defiance was surely dead, consumed by the flames. To Cain, staggering to his feet outside, his ears ringing, his face peppered with splinters, it was a Pyrrhic victory. The widow was dead, but the mapped entire purpose of his bloody campaign was now ash, buried under a burning pyre. A wave of pure, nihilistic rage washed over him. He had lost men, he had lost time, and he had lost the prize. All he had left was vengeance. "Burn it," he screamed, his voice a ragged shriek that was half madness. "Burn it all. Leave nothing but ashes." The remaining jackals, their numbers now less than half of what they started with, responded to their leader's madness with their own. They had lost the battle for control. Now they would fight a war of pure spite. They began to set fires, throwing torches into the livery stable and the assayer's office. The wind, which had been still all night, began to pick up, fanning the flames, threatening to turn the entire town into a funeral pyre. But the spirit of Haven was not so easily extinguished. The explosion that was meant to be their breaking point became their rallying cry. Seeing the flames spread, the townspeople fought with a new, desperate fury. They were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. Sheriff Miller, his leg bandaged, directed the defense from a wheelchair, his voice a steady, commanding bark. Gunnery led a charge from the general store, his hammer swinging, scattering a group of outlaws trying to set fire to the church. In the cellar beneath her burning home, Isabel fought her own desperate battle against the suffocating smoke that was beginning to seep through the floorboards. Panic gave way to a cold, clear-headed focus. She remembered the tunnel. The cellar in her house was not yet connected to the main network, but the work had been started. At the far end of the cellar was a section of wall made of loose rock and packed earth, where the digging was supposed to begin. She grabbed a fallen beam, its end charred and smoking, and began to attack the wall. She clawed at the dirt with her bare hands, her nails tearing, her lungs burning. The smoke grew thicker. The heat from the fire above was becoming unbearable. It was a race against asphyxiation. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, she broke through. A trickle of cool, clean air met her face. She clawed at the opening, widening it, until she could squeeze her bruised body through into the narrow and finished tunnel. She was out of the tomb. She crawled through the darkness, following the tunnel until she emerged, covered in soot and dirt, into the cellar of the general store. The women and children huddled there stared at her as if they were seeing a ghost. She had walked out of her own grave. But there was no time for explanations. The town was burning. She emerged into the back room of the store to a scene of controlled chaos. Doc Miller was patching up a wounded rancher. Henderson, his arm in a sling, was handing out buckets of water. When they saw her, they froze, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Isabel," Henderson breathed. We thought you were dead." "Not yet," she said, her voice a raw rasp. She took the bucket of water from his hands. "The well pump behind the forge is the strongest. We need a chain. We need to fight the fire." Her sudden, impossible appearance was a miracle. The news spread like wildfire itself. The widow is alive. The despair that had begun to creep into the hearts of the defenders was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, of unbelievable hope. If she could survive that blast, they could survive this night. Isabel, Gunnery, and the others organized the town into a bucket brigade. While some men continued to hold off the remaining jackals, the rest of the townmen, women, and even the older children formed a line from the well to the fires. It was a desperate, heroic effort. They fought the flames with the same grit and determination with which they had fought the outlaws. Kane, watching from the shadows, saw his final plan failing. He saw the town rally. He saw them fighting the fires, saving their homes. And then, through the smoke and haze, he saw her, the widow, soot-stained, her dress torn, a bucket in her hand, but unmistakably alive. It broke him. She was not a woman, she was a force of nature, an unkillable spirit. His game was shattered, his prize was lost, and the town he had tried to destroy was refusing to burn. Defeat, absolute and humiliating, settled upon him. He and the few men he had left, including the other men who had escaped the blast, faded back into the darkness. They mounted their horses and rode away, not as conquerors, but as beaten dogs slinking away from a fight they could never win. As the sun began to rise, its first pale fingers of light touching a town scarred by battle and fire, the last of the flames were extinguished. Haven was still standing. It was battered, burned, and bleeding, but it was standing. And in the center of the street stood Isabel Hartley, surrounded by the people she had led, her face a mask of soot and exhaustion, her eyes reflecting the embers of the fires she had both started and extinguished. She had lost her home, but she had saved her town. The dawn that broke over Haven was a quiet, somber affair. The rising sun illuminated a scene of devastation. Smoldering ruins, shattered windows, and the grim, still forms of the dead lay under a pall of smoke that hung in the cool morning air. But it was also the dawn of a new day, a day that belonged to the townspeople. The jackals were gone. The silence that returned was not the silence of fear, but of weary, hard-won peace. The work of rebuilding began almost immediately. The living tended to the wounded and buried the dead, their own and the outlaws, with a grim, shared purpose. There was no victory parade, no celebration. The cost had been too high. But in every face, there was a new look of ownership, of pride. They had faced the fire and had not broken. This was their town in a way it had never been before. In the midst of it all stood Isabel. She was no longer just Mrs. Hartley, the quiet widow. She was a living symbol of their resilience. People looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She had been the spark, the strategist, the bait, and, in the end, the ghost who had walked out of the flames. Sheriff Miller, his leg propped up on a crate, watched her as she helped clear debris. "You know," he said to Gunnery, who was already assessing the damage to the livery, "I think we just found Haven's new mayor and sheriff. And maybe it's damn sane." Gunnery just grunted, but for the first time, it sounded like an agreement. Later that day, when a measure of order had been restored, Isabel walked alone to the cemetery on the hill. The town lay below her, scarred but whole. The air was clear up here, the scent of smoke carried away on the breeze. She knelt by Elias's grave. The wooden cross was untouched by the battle. With her bare, bruised hands, she carefully dug into the earth at its base. Her fingers found the familiar oilskin package. It was safe. Everything she had done, all the violence and the loss, had been to protect this small, fragile thing. She unwrapped it slowly. She looked at the cryptic map, the key to a fortune that could rebuild Haven 10 times over. For a long moment, she considered her options. She could use it, as Elias had dreamed, to build a new future, to found a dynasty of prosperity on this hard-won piece of ground. But as she looked down at the town, at the people working together, their faces grim but determined, she realized something profound. Elias's dream had already come true. The foundation he had wanted to build with gold had been forged instead in fire and courage. The treasure wasn't buried in some remote mountain pass, it was alive and breathing in the streets below. It was in Gunnery's steadfast strength, in the sheriff's rediscovered honor, and Henderson's surprising bravery, in the quiet heroism of all the men and women who had refused to run. To use the gold now would be to taint that. It would bring new vultures, new jackals, new men like Marshall Davies, all drawn by the scent of wealth. It would turn their moral victory into a land rush. With a sense of absolute clarity, she took a match from a small tin she carried. She struck it on a stone, the small flame a bright, defiant spark in the afternoon light. She touched it to the corner of the vellum map. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges, turning the cryptic symbols to black ash. She held it until the flames licked at her fingertips, then she dropped the last burning ember onto the earth of her husband's grave. The secret of the Eagle's Nest payroll was gone forever, its smoke mingling with the smoke from the town below before vanishing into the vast, blue western sky. She was no longer the keeper of a dead man's promise. She was the architect of a living one. She walked back down the hill, not as a widow returning to an empty house, but as a leader returning to her people. Her house was gone, but for the first time since Elias's death, she was truly home. And so we leave our tale, but the legend of Haven lives on. A story whispered in the West, of a town that was supposed to die, but refused. It's the story of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage, all led by a quiet widow who taught them that the greatest treasures are not buried in the ground, but are forged in the human heart. It is the story of Isabel Hartley, who proved that even from the deepest grief, the fiercest strength can rise.